Story number 1.
I never thought I'd be the kind of person to see something I couldn't explain, let alone something that would keep me up for the rest of my life. It was supposed to be a celebration. My sister Lindsay had just gotten her doctorate, and my family decided to splurge on a week-long cruise. It wasn't one of those massive party ships. It was an older, smaller cruise liner that ran a quiet route through the Caribbean. Honestly, it felt a little old-fashioned, but my parents thought it was charming and had character. That's how we found ourselves boarding the Sea Mist one humid afternoon in late May. From the beginning, the ship had a different vibe than I was expecting. The crew was polite but distant, almost mechanical. The halls were dimly lit, not like the glossy cruise advertisements I'd seen online. The carpet smelled faintly of mildew, and a few parts of the deck creaked underfoot. It had the feel of an old hell that had seen better days. But it was fine, I told myself, just a little wear and tear. Our cabin was on deck 4, tucked away in a narrow hallway that always seemed unnaturally cold, even though the rest of the ship was sweltering. I didn't think much of it at first. I just cranked the tiny metal air vent closed above my bed and shrugged it off. The first 2 nights were normal. Drinks, buffet dinners, a few excursions. But starting the 3rd night, things started happening. It began with noises, low, scraping sounds from the walls. I assumed it was the ship itself groaning against the water. Lindsay teased me for being a city girl unused to old vessels. But the sounds weren't random. They had a pattern, almost like something was being dragged down the hallway outside our room. Late at night, when the ship was quiet, it would start. First, soft metallic scraping, then a slow, heavy thump, spaced out every few seconds, growing louder as it moved closer to our door. I told Lindsay. She rolled her eyes and said it was probably a service cart or some drunk passenger stumbling back to their cabin. But that didn't explain why. When I finally got brave enough to peek through the peephole at 2 in the morning, the hallway was completely empty. And yet, the dragging sound was right outside our door. The next day, I tried to casually bring it up to one of the crew members, a woman named Marisol, who worked the housekeeping shift. Her face immediately tightened. She mumbled something about old plumbing and scurried away, refusing to meet my eyes. That night, I was determined not to be scared. Lindsay had gone to the casino, leaving me alone in the cabin. I stayed up, reading on my bed with the tiny TV playing some rerun sitcom. Midnight came and went. I was about to turn off the lights when I noticed the room felt colder again, the same way it did in the hallway. The air felt thick, heavy in my chest. And then I heard it. The scraping again. But this time, it was inside the room. I froze. The sound was coming from the far corner near the small closet. The closet door trembled slightly, just enough to catch my eye. I couldn't move. It was like something had latched onto my spine and anchored me to the bed. Slowly, painfully, the closet door creaked open a few inches. There was nothing inside but our jackets and a spare pair of sandals. But behind them, no, through them, I saw a shape. It wasn't solid. It shimmered faintly, like heat on asphalt. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its head nearly brushed the top of the closet. I couldn't make out a face, just a pale, distorted outline, swaying gently like it was underwater. I blinked. When I opened my eyes, it was gone. Just empty jackets. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Nerves. I was tired. Anything to keep from thinking about what I had seen. The following day, I felt like I was being watched everywhere I went on the ship. Mirrors seemed to catch glimpses of movement that vanished when I turned. The reflections felt wrong, slightly delayed, as if the ship itself was breathing behind me. When I finally worked up the nerve to tell Lindsay everything, she didn't laugh. She just looked uncomfortable and said she hadn't wanted to tell me, but she'd had a weird experience too. The night before, when she came back from the casino, she'd found wet footprints on the carpet leading from the hallway into our room. But the ship was dry. No rain, no pools nearby, and the prints didn't match the shape of any shoes we owned. They were long, bare footprints with unnaturally thin toes. We decided to spend the next night together in the room, lights on, TV blaring. Around 3 a.m., Lindsay shook me awake. She pointed at the ceiling, her finger trembling. There were faint thumps overhead, like someone was walking or dragging something across the deck above us. That wasn't unusual on a cruise, but we were on the top passenger deck. Above us was the navigation room and the restricted crew-only areas. No one should have been there at that hour. The thumping grew louder, turning into harsh, scraping sounds. Then we heard breathing. Not ours. It was wet, ragged breathing, right outside our door, like something struggling for air. I wanted to scream, but I bit down on my hand, tears welling in my eyes. The door handle rattled violently for a few seconds, then stopped. A minute later, we heard the sound retreating, the same dragging shuffle, moving back down the hallway. We barely slept. The next morning, Lindsay and I agreed we had to get off the ship at the next port. We didn't care if we had to book last-minute flights or find some seedy motel. We couldn't stay another night. But when we reached the reception desk to ask about disembarking, the woman behind the counter gave us a strained smile and said it wasn't possible until the final port. Once you're aboard, she said softly, you have to finish the journey. That night, desperate to avoid sleeping in our haunted cabin, we wandered the ship until late. We found ourselves in the main lounge area, which was mostly abandoned. Only an elderly couple sat dozing in the corner, and a bartender polishing glasses without really looking at them. Something about the room felt different that night. The lights were dimmer than usual, and there was a faint saltwater smell, even though the doors were closed. Lindsay pointed to an old painting on the wall, one I hadn't noticed before. It showed a stormy sea, with a cruise liner almost identical to ours struggling against the waves. If you looked closely, you could see faint shapes in the water, arms, faces, half-submerged bodies reaching out toward the ship. Before I could say anything, the bartender was suddenly at our side. He spoke in a low voice without making eye contact. You're not the first to see them, he said. Sometimes they find people who can see past the surface. Once they notice you, they don't let go. We tried to get him to explain more, but he just shook his head and walked away, leaving us even more terrified. That night was the worst. As soon as we got back to our cabin, it started. The air turned ice cold. The lights flickered, then died, leaving us in darkness except for the emergency nightlight by the bathroom. We huddled on the bed together, clutching each other. Around 2 a.m., the closet door creaked open again. Something stepped out. It wasn't the shimmering figure from before. It was clearer now, taller than any human, with limbs that bent the wrong way, pale skin stretched too tightly over its bones. Its face was a blur, like someone had smeared it with wet hands. Its feet dragged along the carpet, leaving a trail of dark, wet stains. It moved toward us. We couldn't scream. We couldn't move. It leaned close, its face inches from ours. I could smell the stench of salt water and rot on its breath. Then it spoke, not in words, but in a low, bubbling whisper that filled my mind. You see me now. I must have blacked out. When I came to, it was morning. Lindsay was already awake, sitting stiffly on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the floor. Neither of us spoke for a long time. When we finally docked and stumbled off the ship, I felt like a weight had been lifted. But it wasn't over. For weeks after, I would catch glimpses of water pooling under doors that should have been dry. I'd hear the slow scrape of something dragging behind me in empty parking garages. Sometimes at night, I'd wake up to find my closet door ajar, even though I knew I'd closed it. And every now and then, just before I fall asleep, I hear it breathing. Still waiting. Still there. Story the end.
Story number 2.
When I took the job on the Violet Mariner, I figured it was the perfect gig. 6 months on a luxury cruise ship traveling through the Caribbean, getting paid to bartend for wealthy tourists who tipped well after a few rum punches. The crew told me stories. Every ship has them, about superstitions and sea ghosts. But I always smiled politely and shrugged it off. Ghosts were for tourists and movies, not for real life. The Violet Mariner was an old ship, a retired ocean liner from the 1960s that had been renovated into a floating resort. It had character. That's what the brochures said. Dark wooden hallways, brass fixtures, velvet curtains, it all looked glamorous in the daytime. But at night, the halls were long and dimly lit, with the old floorboards groaning underfoot. There were areas of the ship that passengers weren't allowed to access, maintenance corridors, sealed cabins, abandoned lounges, and we were warned to steer clear unless absolutely necessary. The first strange thing happened 3 weeks into my contract. I was closing the main deck bar around 2 a.m. after a long party. Most of the guests had stumbled off to their cabins, and only the cleaning staff remained, wiping down the tables and stacking chairs. I was rinsing the last few glasses when I noticed a woman standing by the railing, staring out into the dark ocean. She wore a white evening gown that looked almost vintage, and her hair was tied up in an old-fashioned twist. I called out to her, asking if she needed anything. She didn't respond. She didn't even move. Her hands were clasped so tightly over the railing that her knuckles looked white in the moonlight. I wiped my hands on a towel and stepped out from behind the bar to approach her. "Miss, are you okay?" I asked. Still no response. I was maybe 10 feet away when she suddenly turned her head to look at me. Her face was beautiful, but strange. Pale, with deep-set glassy eyes that seemed to shimmer unnaturally. Before I could react, she leaned backward and tipped herself over the rail. I ran to the spot where she had been standing, heart pounding so loud I could barely think. I expected to hear a splash or see her body floating in the water. But there was nothing. The ocean was calm and black, stretching out in every direction under the night sky. I shouted for help. Security arrived minutes later, throwing spotlights over the side, launching lifeboats to search. We spent hours combing the water, but we found no one. No body. No splash on the surveillance cameras. In fact, when they checked the tapes, there was no sign of a woman in white at all. The officers told me it must have been exhaustion. Maybe I had imagined it. But the cleaning crew saw me sprint across the deck. They saw me shouting over the railing. They knew I wasn't making it up. Still, we were told to keep it quiet. No reason to scare the guests. After that night, I started noticing odd things. Lights flickering in cabins that should have been empty, cold drafts in warm hallways, whispers in the elevator shaft when I was riding alone. Once, I walked past a ballroom that had been shuttered for renovations, and I swear I heard music playing. A scratchy, slow waltz. When I peeked through the dusty glass, I saw dark figures moving across the dance floor in slow, rhythmic steps. I blinked, and they were gone. The other crew members weren't surprised when I told them. They had their own stories. Emma, one of the housekeeping supervisors, told me she refused to clean cabin 303 after she found all the mirrors inside fogged up from the inside, despite the air conditioning running full blast. Victor, a maintenance worker, said he once saw wet footprints leading down a maintenance corridor that hadn't been used in years. The ship had a history, they said, a long one. Supposedly back in the 1970s, a woman had gone overboard after a heated argument with her husband. Some said she had been pushed. Some said she jumped. Either way, her body was never recovered. After that, passengers and crew began reporting sightings of a woman in white, always near the rails at night, always staring out to sea. I tried to laugh it off. I told myself it was just stories. Sleep deprivation. The power of suggestion. But it got harder to ignore the feeling that I was being watched, especially during the night shifts. It felt like the air on the ship got heavier after dark, like moving through water. One night after another late shift, I was walking back to my cabin on one of the lower decks. The hallways were quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. As I rounded the corner toward my door, I froze. There she was, standing directly in front of my cabin, the woman in the white dress. Her back was to me, her hair still in that perfect twist, the hem of her dress drifting slightly as if there was a breeze in the sealed hallway. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to move closer, but I couldn't exactly run back the way I came. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard it hurt. I blinked once, twice, hoping she would vanish like a trick of the light. Instead, she turned around slowly to face me. Her face was different now. Her mouth hung slightly open, and her eyes... God! Her eyes... They were sunken, almost hollow, with something dark and endless inside them. I stepped back instinctively, tripping over my own feet. She started to walk toward me, each step slow but deliberate, like she was moving underwater. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to think. Was this some elaborate prank? Some actor hired by the cruise line for ambiance? But the terror in my gut told me otherwise. I stumbled backward down the hallway, never taking my eyes off her. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the lights overhead flickered and went out for a fraction of a second. When they came back on, she was gone. I didn't sleep in my cabin that night. I found a couch in the crew lounge and stayed there until morning, lights blazing and TV turned up just loud enough to drown out the silence. Things escalated after that. I wasn't the only one seeing her anymore. Guests started complaining about nightmares. Children woke up screaming about the lady with the black eyes standing at the foot of their beds. One morning, the ship's chef found the words, "Come with me," scratched into the inside of a locked walk-in freezer door where nobody had been all night. The captain called a crew meeting, something that almost never happened. He was a stern man, ex-Navy, not the type to scare easily. He told us to stay professional, to keep the guests calm, and to report any incidents directly to security. But the look in his eyes said more than his words. He was scared too. The final night of that voyage, and my last night aboard the Violet Mariner, was the worst. We were docked offshore near a small island. The ship was quiet. Most guests were ashore for a beach party. I was doing inventory behind the bar when the lights flickered again. Not just in the bar, the whole ship. The engines rumbled like they were coughing. Then everything went dead silent. Not just quiet, silent. The air conditioning, the usual hum of the generators, the gentle creaking of the ship, all of it stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the corridor leading to the bar. I waited, frozen behind the counter. The footsteps got closer. I saw the shadow before I saw her, long and thin, stretching across the doorway like a black stain. She stepped into the bar, the woman in white. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her were more figures, dozens of them, men, women, even children, all soaked to the bone, clothes clinging to their bodies, eyes dark and hollow like hers. They moved soundlessly, their wet feet slapping against the wooden floor. Their faces were twisted in expressions of sorrow, anger, despair. I didn't wait to see what they wanted. I bolted through the service door and ran. I didn't care where I was going, just away from them. The ship had become a maze. Every hallway looked the same. Every corner I turned seemed to bring me back to the same spot. I could hear them following, the wet slap, slap, slap of their bare feet getting louder. I finally burst out onto the main deck, gasping for air. The night sky stretched out above me, stars smeared across the heavens. The gangway was still down, connecting the ship to a small tender boat below. I didn't think, I just ran for it. Halfway across the gangway, I made the mistake of looking back. They were all standing at the railings now, rows and rows of them, then watching me with their empty eyes. And the woman in white stood at the front, her mouth moving silently, her hands reaching out as if beckoning. The air grew cold. I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I turned and jumped into the tender boat, scrambling to start the small engine. It sputtered and coughed, but finally roared to life. As I pulled away from the ship, I looked back one last time. The Violet Mariner loomed in the dark, its lights flickering weakly. The figures were still there, watching, waiting. And as the distance grew, they began to fade, like mist dissolving into the night. I never went back. I broke my contract, forfeited my pay, and caught the first flight home. I told myself I was done with the sea, done with ships, done with whatever nightmare haunted the Violet Mariner. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the house creaks with the settling of wood, I swear I hear it again. The slow, wet slap of footsteps in the dark. Story the end.
Story number 3.
Of all the vacations I had taken in my life, the cruise was supposed to be the most carefree. A week at sea, isolated from the world, nothing but waves and cocktails. The ship, the Veramaris, was an older vessel, but that only added to its charm, people said. Worn brass rails, creaky wooden decks, faded paintings of ports the ship hadn't visited in decades. It all gave the cruise a nostalgic air that I admittedly found comforting at first. It was the third night when things started feeling wrong. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of knocking. Slow, deliberate, 3 knocks in a row, then silence. At first, I thought maybe it was just someone drunk, wandering the halls and mistaking my door for their own. But the knocks were so sharp, so precise, it didn't feel like drunken clumsiness. When I dragged myself out of bed and peered through the peephole, there was no one there. The hallway was empty and lit with that weak, yellowish lighting that made everything look a little sick. I almost went back to bed, but a flicker of movement caught my eye. A woman in a dark dress was standing at the end of the hall. Her back was to me. her long black hair hanging down in thick, tangled clumps. She wasn't moving, just standing there. I stared for a long moment, feeling a chill spread through my chest before finally blinking, and she was gone. The next morning, I tried to laugh it off. Cruise ships had stories, legends. Hell, the Vera Maris was probably older than half the passengers on board. Maybe I was just letting the atmosphere get to me. Still, I asked at the front desk if anyone had reported strange behavior during the night. The young woman behind the counter, a thin blonde with a stiff smile, hesitated just a second too long before shaking her head. "No disturbances reported," she said, but her eyes slid away from mine as she said it. I decided to forget about it and spent the day by the pool. But late that afternoon, while sipping a watery margarita and watching the sun sink toward the endless line of the horizon, I overheard two older women whispering in the lounge chairs next to me. "Another one last night," one of them said, her voice low. "Yeah, fourth deck again, near the stern," said the other. "Same story. Knocking. No one there." I strained to listen without being obvious, but they soon caught me eavesdropping and clammed up. I pretended not to notice, focusing on the slow roll of the waves, but my mind wouldn't stop chewing on their words. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the woman I'd seen. Around midnight, I decided to walk the ship, hoping that some exercise would tire me out. I left my cabin, making sure the door clicked locked behind me, and wandered toward the stern, where the older women had said the strange things happened. Deck 4 was quieter than the others. Most of the bars and shops were on the higher levels, so the only sounds were the low hum of the ship's engines and the faint sloshing of water against the hull. I was walking past a row of empty cabins when I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. It was so loud and close that I jumped, spinning around. It came from one of the doors a few feet down. I stared at it, my heart hammering, and after a moment I walked toward it. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe. Some stupid instinct to see for myself. The door was plain, like all the others, with a faded brass number plate, 472. I put my ear to it. Nothing. No sound inside. I knocked back lightly. Nothing. Then, without warning, the door creaked open an inch, revealing only darkness inside. I should have left. I should have turned around and sprinted back to my cabin. But some part of me felt pulled forward, like an invisible hook was snagged deep in my chest. I pushed the door open farther and stepped inside. The room was freezing cold, far colder than the humid, sticky corridors outside. My breath puffed out in small clouds. The light from the hallway barely penetrated the gloom, but I could just make out the outlines of a bed, a dresser, a cracked mirror, and something else, a shape sitting in the corner. I squinted, trying to make it out. It looked like a woman, huddled on the floor, her hair covering her face. Her dress, if that's what it was, clung to her thin frame like wet rags. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I took a step closer. The woman's head snapped up. Her face, or what should have been her face, was a void, a smooth, featureless stretch of skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. I stumbled back, tripping over the doorway threshold, and landed hard in the hall. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I was back in my cabin. Door locked, chain latched, chair shoved against it for good measure. I sat up the rest of the night, every creak of the ship setting my nerves on edge. The next day, I debated getting off at the next port. Cutting my trip short, losing the money, didn't matter. I just wanted off. But when I asked at the desk about an early disembarkation, the same stiff-smiling woman told me it wasn't possible. "The next port is a restricted dock, crew only," she said almost too quickly. I noticed something else too. Passengers were disappearing. Not a lot, just one or two at a time. People who had been sitting at dinner tables the night before were suddenly missing. Their chairs pushed in neatly, their plates cleared. No announcements were made, no explanations given. When I asked around, people acted like they didn't notice or didn't want to notice. By the fifth night, the knocking came again. Louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. Followed by a long scrape, like nails dragging down the outside of my cabin door. I lay in bed, paralyzed, the covers pulled up to my chin like a child hiding from monsters. At some point, exhausted, I fell asleep. I woke up to water soaking the floor of my cabin. It was cold, ankle deep, and rising slowly. Panicked, I checked the bathroom. thinking maybe a pipe had burst, but there was no leak. It was as if the water was seeping straight up through the floor. Then I heard a voice, a soft whisper, barely audible over the lapping of the water. "Help me." I turned and saw the woman again, the same faceless figure, standing at the foot of my bed. Her arms were outstretched, reaching for me, her fingers twitching. I ran, barefoot, soaked, not even caring who saw me. I sprinted down the hallways, up the stairwells, until I found myself on the main deck. The night air was thick and salty, and the deck was deserted except for one other figure, standing by the rail. It was an older man, maybe in his 60s, wearing a faded officer's uniform. I recognized him vaguely, one of the ship's original crew members, someone who'd retired but stayed aboard to help with special tasks, the brochures had said. He turned to me, his face lined with exhaustion. "You saw her, didn't you?" he said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. He sighed and looked out at the endless black sea. "She was a passenger long ago, fell overboard during a storm. They say it was an accident, but..." He shook his head. "Some folks say the ship wanted her, and now it won't let her go." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. "She knocks," he continued. "If you open the door, she finds you. Once she's seen you, really seen you, you can't get away. The ship makes sure of that." "What do I do?" I whispered. He gave me a sad, pitying smile. "You survive, or you don't." The next days blurred together. I hardly slept. I stayed in the public areas, surrounded by other passengers, never alone. But it didn't matter. She found ways to get closer. Reflections in windows, shadows in stairwells, flickering images in the old, cracked mirrors that hung in the hallways. Other passengers began vanishing faster. The ship grew quieter, the crew harder to find. Meals were left unattended in the dining areas. The pool water turned murky and green. The lights flickered constantly. One night, desperate, I tried to send a message using the ship's satellite phone. The call never connected. Static filled my ears, and in the static, I heard her voice again. "Help me." On the last night, I woke to find my cabin door wide open. The water was back, swirling around my bed, waist deep now. Floating toward me was something white, a scrap of fabric, a torn piece of a dress. And then she was there, dragging herself through the water, her arms flailing weakly, her head lolling side to side. The faceless woman. The drowned woman. I screamed and ran. I made it to the lifeboat deck, but most of the boats were missing, gone, torn loose or simply not there at all. Only one remained, hanging crookedly from its pulleys. I didn't care. I clambered into it, struggling with the release levers, praying they would still work. As I fumbled, I saw her standing at the edge of the deck, just a few feet away. Her hair hung in wet ropes around her shoulders. Her arms reached out for me. The lifeboat jerked and plunged into the black ocean. I hit the water hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. I scrambled into the boat, gasping, coughing up seawater. When I looked back at the ship, the Vera Maris was fading into the mist. It didn't look old and charming anymore. It looked rotten, decaying. A floating corpse of a ship. I floated for hours, maybe longer. Eventually a cargo vessel found me. They hauled me aboard, half mad and raving. They didn't believe my story, of course. How could they? But I know what I saw. I know what followed me. And sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and I'm alone, I hear it again. Knock, knock, knock. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The first time I agreed to work on a cruise ship, I thought it would be a dream. Traveling the world, meeting new people, living at sea, it all sounded perfect. I signed a 6-month contract as a bartender aboard the Ocean's Glory, one of those massive floating cities with 15 decks, endless buffets, and a dozen bars scattered across the ship. It was supposed to be an adventure, something to look back on when I got older. The ship left from Miami on a humid August afternoon, heading for a Caribbean loop. Everything was smooth for the first few weeks. I made friends with other crew members, got used to the odd hours, and even learned to sleep through the constant hum of the engines. But around the 3rd week, things began to shift. The first strange thing happened during a late-night shift at the Compass Lounge, one of the quieter bars on Deck 7. It was around 2 a.m., and only a few passengers remained, nursing their last drinks. I was cleaning glasses behind the bar when the lights flickered. It wasn't unusual. Sometimes the ship's electrical systems hiccuped. But when I glanced up, I saw a woman standing at the far end of the bar. She wore an outdated blue dress, the kind you might have seen in the 1950s, and her hair was pinned up in neat curls. At first, I thought she was a guest dressed for some themed event, but there was something wrong about her. She was soaking wet. Water dripped from her hair and dress, pooling at her feet. I opened my mouth to ask if she needed help, but when I blinked, she was gone. No puddle. No trace she'd ever been there. I chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe I just imagined it. Long hours and rocking seas could play tricks on you. I didn't even mention it to anyone. A few nights later, during another late shift, I heard something strange. I was walking back to my cabin on deck 4, the crew quarters, when I heard laughter, soft, almost childlike, coming from the hallway ahead. It was odd because most of the crew would either be asleep or still working. When I turned the corner, no one was there, just a long, empty hallway, dimly lit by overhead fluorescence. I stood there for a moment, listening. The laughter started again, this time right behind me. I spun around, but again, nothing. I hurried back to my cabin and locked the door. That night, I barely slept. Over breakfast the next morning, I finally brought it up to Danny, another bartender I'd grown close to. She lowered her voice and leaned in. "You've heard about the ship's history, right?" I shook my head. "What history?" Danny glanced around to make sure no one was listening. The Ocean's Glory wasn't always a luxury liner. Parts of it were salvaged from an older ship, the Seraphine. There was a fire on board back in the 60s. Killed dozens of people. They say pieces of the Seraphine were reused when building the ship to save money. I stared at her, trying to decide if she was messing with me. "They say," she continued, "some of the passengers didn't leave." I laughed it off, but the story stuck with me. The idea of sailing on a patchwork ship stitched together from a tragedy made the air feel heavier. More things began happening. One evening, while cleaning up the lounge after closing, I heard footsteps on the upper deck above the bar. The Compass Lounge had a little balcony area for live music. The lights were off, and I knew for a fact it was locked up tight. Still, the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps echoed above me. I called out, "Hello? We're closed." No response. Just the sound of slow walking. I grabbed the flashlight we kept behind the bar and cautiously made my way upstairs. The balcony was empty, of course. No sign of anyone. But when I turned to go back down, I noticed something out of place. A single, wet footprint on the wooden floor. The footprint was small, like a child's, and it led directly to the balcony railing, then stopped. That night I lay awake in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, jumping at every creak and groan of the ship. I wasn't the only one noticing things either. A housekeeper named Maria told me she'd heard knocking from inside vacant cabins. A maintenance guy swore he saw a little boy run across the main lobby late one night, only for the kid to vanish into thin air. One night, about a month into the cruise, we hit rough weather. A tropical storm caught up with us, and the ship rolled and pitched so violently that most passengers stayed in their cabins. I was assigned to help out with a small emergency station, handing out seasickness pills and bottled water to guests who were feeling rough. Around 1 a.m., during a lull, I took a break outside on the open deck. The rain whipped sideways and the ocean churned into massive white-tipped waves. I stood by the railing, the storm spray hitting my face, when I saw her again, the woman in the blue dress. She stood about 20 feet away, clinging to the railing with one hand. Her dress whipped around her, water dripping from her hair, but she didn't seem to notice the storm. She stared straight at me. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Then slowly, she lifted her free hand and pointed at something behind me. I turned instinctively, scanning the dark deck. At first, I saw nothing, just empty lounge chairs lashed down against the storm. But when I squinted, I realized there was a dark shape at the edge of the deck, a figure hunched over the railing. Before I could move, the figure climbed over and disappeared into the waves. I screamed and ran toward where the figure had jumped, but there was no one there, no sign of anyone falling, no alarms, no splashes, nothing. The woman in the blue dress was gone too. I reported what I saw to the bridge, and they conducted a head count of passengers and crew. No one was missing. That event changed me. I wasn't just scared anymore. I was unsettled to my core. I started seeing things more frequently. Faces in windows, shadows slipping through hallways, reflections in mirrors that didn't match what I was doing. During a crew meeting one morning, our supervisor addressed it without directly admitting anything. "Remember," he said, looking grim, "working on a ship can mess with your mind. Long hours, isolation, the constant movement, it can cause hallucinations. If anyone needs to speak to the ship's counselor, you're encouraged to do so." No one said a word, but the glances we exchanged told me I wasn't the only one being haunted. The final incident happened 2 weeks before my contract ended. I was closing up the Compass Lounge alone. Everyone else had gone to bed. I turned off the lights, cleaned the bar, and headed for the door. But when I reached for the handle, the door wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked, it just wouldn't open, like some invisible force was holding it shut. I pulled harder. Nothing. Then the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath in front of me, little clouds puffing out into the dark. From behind me, I heard the soft sound of footsteps. I turned around slowly. In the faint emergency light, I saw them. People. Dozens of them. Their faces pale and dripping, their eyes hollow. They stood silently across the room, staring at me. I stumbled back against the door, heart hammering against my ribs. I squeezed my eyes shut, whispering, "This isn't real. This isn't real." When I opened them again, the figures were gone. The door swung open easily behind me, almost sending me sprawling backward into the hallway. I didn't work another shift after that. I spent the last 2 weeks of my contract holed up in my cabin, venturing out only when absolutely necessary. When we finally docked back in Miami, I nearly cried stepping onto solid ground. I never signed another cruise contract. I've tried to talk myself out of what I saw, blame it on stress or sleep deprivation. But some nights, when it's raining and the wind howls outside my apartment window, I swear I can still hear the soft creak of footsteps overhead, the whisper of laughter down the hall, and the low hum of the ocean's glory's engine.
Story number 5.
The first time I saw the cruise ship, it didn't feel right. Maybe it was the way the mist clung to its sides like a second skin, or the way its massive body loomed against the harbor lights almost as if it didn't want to be seen. I should have listened to my gut, but I was too excited for the vacation my friends and I had been planning for months. 5 days at sea, endless food, pools, shows. What could go wrong? There were 6 of us: me, Elena, Matt, Chris, Jordan, and Ashley. We were college friends, and we wanted one last hurrah before real adult life pulled us in different directions. The cruise was called the Ocean's Grace, a supposedly refurbished ship from the 1980s. When we boarded, everything looked freshly painted, the brass rails polished, the carpet still smelling faintly of glue. But beneath all that was something older. You could sense it the way you sense someone staring at you from across a room. The first day went fine. We explored the ship, had too much to drink, lounged by the pool. That night, though, something changed. I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside my cabin. At first, I thought it was just some drunk guests stumbling back to their rooms. But when the footsteps paused right outside my door and stayed there, not moving, not retreating, I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I lay still, staring at the door. The handle didn't move. There was no knock. But I swear I heard breathing, deep and rattling, almost like someone struggling for air. After a minute, the footsteps started again, heavy and slow, fading down the hallway. I didn't sleep much after that. At breakfast the next morning, I brought it up, half laughing it off. Everyone else dismissed it, blaming my imagination or too many rum cocktails. But Ashley went quiet. When I pressed her, she admitted she'd heard it too. The same slow, deliberate footsteps outside her room. But she said it hadn't sounded drunk. It sounded wrong. We tried to shake it off, diving back into the vacation spirit. That afternoon, the ship docked at a small island for a few hours. We wandered the beach, bought overpriced trinkets, and laughed about getting haunted the night before. But when we returned to the ship, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a woman standing at the railing on deck 7, staring out at the sea. She wore a long, outdated dress, something you'd see in a black and white movie, and her hair was pinned up in an old-fashioned style. She wasn't moving. Even when the ship's horn blared, signaling departure, she didn't flinch. I nudged Elena and pointed. "See her?" Elena squinted. "See who?" I blinked. The woman was gone. There was nothing but an empty stretch of deck, gleaming in the sun. That night, things got worse. Chris decided we should explore parts of the ship not meant for guests. "Just for kicks," he said. The idea was stupid, but peer pressure is a powerful thing. We waited until after midnight, then slipped past a security rope near the stern. The air back there was thick and salty, and the metal walls felt damp under our hands. We found a service staircase and went down, past the crew quarters and into the bowels of the ship. The lights were dim, buzzing slightly, and the corridors seemed to narrow the farther we went. The carpet gave way to slick, bare metal floors. It smelled of oil and something else, something sour and rotten. At one point, Jordan stopped walking. "You guys hear that?" he whispered. We fell silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the creak of the ship. Then, faintly, from somewhere ahead, we heard it. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. "Probably a maintenance guy," Chris said, but his voice wasn't convincing. We turned a corner and found ourselves facing a massive steel door, slightly ajar. It looked ancient, rust blooming at its edges. On impulse, Matt pushed it open wider. Inside was a long room, dimly lit by a single swinging bulb. It was filled with old furniture, broken chairs, cracked tables, piles of moldy mattresses. It smelled worse in there, a wet, suffocating stench. And standing in the far corner was the woman. Same long dress, same pinned-up hair. Her face was pale and slack, eyes wide and glassy, as if she was underwater. She didn't move, she just stared. For a full, paralyzed second, none of us spoke. Then Elena let out a strangled scream and bolted. The rest of us tore after her, crashing back through the corridors. I didn't dare look back, but I swear I could hear it behind us, the slow scrape of something heavy being dragged. We burst out onto the main deck, gasping for air, faces pale. A security guard spotted us and started yelling, but none of us cared. We just ran to our cabins, locking ourselves in for the night. The next morning, we all agreed something was seriously wrong with this ship. Matt tried to act tough, joking about cruise ship ghosts, but even he looked shaken. Ashley refused to leave her cabin. She said she felt like someone was watching her, even with all the lights on. We tried to convince her to come to breakfast, but she just shook her head, eyes wide and trembling. Later that afternoon, we couldn't find her. We searched everywhere, her cabin, the decks, the lounges. No one had seen her. Eventually, we had to tell the ship's staff. They took it seriously, but after a full sweep, they found nothing. Ashley was just gone. The captain made an announcement over the loudspeakers, asking for any information, but his voice was tight, as if he didn't quite believe it himself. That night, none of us slept. I kept the lights on and sat against the headboard, staring at the door. At around 3 a.m, I heard it again. The footsteps. They were slower this time, dragging as if whoever, whatever, was out there could barely move. And then the doorknob turned, just a little, rattling gently. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The door shuttered once, twice, then stopped. When I finally found the courage to look through the peephole, there was no one there. Just the empty, dim hallway. The next morning, we docked at another island. I practically ran down the gangplank. The fresh air, the open space, it all felt like a blessing. Part of me wanted to stay there, to find a hotel and catch a flight home. But Ashley was still missing. The ship's staff tried to keep it quiet, but word spread among the passengers. Whispers about people seeing a woman in old-fashioned clothes, about cabins turning ice cold for no reason, about mirrors fogging up to reveal messages scratched into them. Stay with us. 2 more days. 2 more days of creeping terror, of trying not to be alone, of listening for the telltale shuffle of footsteps outside the cabin door. On the last night, the ship threw a farewell party. A desperate attempt, I think, to cover the growing sense of dread. Most people attended, laughing too loudly, drinking too much, anything to pretend nothing was wrong. I stayed on deck, staring out at the black, endless water. That's when I saw her again, standing at the railing, just a few feet away. The woman in the dress. Only now I could see her face clearly. It was bloated, the skin around her mouth torn and ragged, as if she'd been screaming underwater. She lifted one hand and pointed at me. I stumbled back, heart slamming against my ribs. I looked around, but no one else seemed to see her. I turned back, and she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the bed, every muscle tense, listening for the sound of the door rattling. It never came. Instead, I heard something else, a soft, wet whisper right by my ear. Stay. The ship docked early the next morning. Disembarking felt surreal, like waking up from a fever dream. I didn't even wait for my friends. I grabbed my bag and pushed through the crowd, desperate to put distance between me and that cursed ship. I never saw Ashley again. Later, I tried to find out more about the Ocean's Grace. It wasn't easy. The cruise line scrubbed most of its history clean. But buried deep in some internet forums, I found old articles about a woman who disappeared from the ship in the 1980s. They never found her body. Some passengers claimed they still saw her drifting through the decks late at night. They said the ship was cursed, that it carried the lost souls of those who had vanished at sea. I believe it now. Because sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear it, the slow, dragging footsteps, and I know she's still looking for me. Story the end.